Mr. Reid, in the last segment, we laid out what the U.S. was saying, what Canada was saying about this dairy dispute. Ultimately, what did the trade panel find?
Ultimately, the trade panel found that Canada breached its obligation under Article 3A to 11B of Annex 3A of the CUSMA.
That is some lawyer talk there, George.
It's buried deep in there, but the words were pretty clear that Canada had to ensure that it did not limit access to quota to processors. So the uncontroverted evidence, uncontested, was that Canada was reserving 85 to 100% of its quota to dairy processors. So in that sense, it was a mercifully simple decision, and the panel did an excellent job in laying everything out, but it was able to come to a conclusion fairly quickly about that. And one key point that the panel made, though, was that the United States raised a fairly narrow argument in this respect. And the panel was at pains to point out that Canada still has considerable discretion about how it was going to go and allocate its dairy quota. And another point is that buried in another part of the agreement, for certain categories of dairy, milk, butter, industrial cheese, the quota could only be used for processing activities, which meant that, on the one hand, Canada couldn't reserve quota for processors, but at least for some dairy products, the quota could only really effectively be used by processors. So in that sense, it was a bit of an odd decision.
So while the decision you've described, George, as a straightforward decision, what's been confusing for some observers, and this I'm going to ask Mr. Clement this question, is that both the U.S. and Canada sort of put out these public statements saying, we won. But obviously that is impossible. You can't both win the dispute. So what was happening there?
So I think it depends on how you look at it. The U.S. won in the context of they brought forward the dispute and the panel ruled in their favor. I think that Ottawa is probably trying to carry the banner saying that they won, mostly because it doesn't completely dismantle supply management, and there are still quite a few provisions that keep a lot of those allocations and quota in place. So I think both camps are arguing that they've won. Who's actually won in this over the other, I'm not quite sure.
So Dr. Charlebois, is there anything you'd like to add about the decision, about who won, why they won? What perspective can you add here?
Well, in my view, I think the Americans won, but we're not sure exactly what the prize is. That's the thing. And frankly, I think Ottawa was right in saying that supply management is being preserved, because it's true. But at the same time, Ottawa really spinned the decision really a little bit politically, and I think we need to admit that.
I'm shocked that politicians on the dairy issue would engage in some spin.
But I do think it exposes the domestic mechanisms that we had, because as George mentioned, we had a lot of discretion. Maybe we abused that discretion a little bit too much, and that's really what happened with this decision. We basically were caught cheating a little bit. That's kind of how I'm reading the decision here.
So, Mr. Reid, now that the decision is out, what happens next? Does Canada have to comply? What's the timeline? Is there an appeal possible? What happens next?
So no appeals possible under the state-to-state dispute resolution. So we're heading towards February 3rd, 2022, which is the date by which Canada and the U.S. have to agree to a resolution. I mean, technically, the U.S. could agree to allow Canada to do what it's doing, and Canada could pay for it. But the U.S. has gone this far. That's not happening. So Canada has to come up with a new allocation methodology that satisfies the U.S. If the U.S. isn't happy, then you get into a scenario where you may have some retaliatory tariffs from the U.S. on Canadian goods, and not just dairy, obviously, like any Canadian goods. So February 3rd is sort of the key date on the calendar to see what the government comes up with.
George, one quick question. This seemed like a narrow category. How much money are we talking about here? We've only got about 30 seconds.
Okay, so farm gate receipts for raw milk in Canada, about $7 billion. For the processors of dairy products, almost $16 billion. the US got about 3.6% access to the market. So we're not talking, we're talking some serious cash here.